The arrow traces its arc through the cold October air. Time seems to suspend itself on this slope of Senlac Hill, 6 miles northwest of Hastings on the 14th day of October in the year of our Lord 1066. The projectile, one among thousands darkening the autumn sky, follows a trajectory that will split history into before and after. Below, 7,000 weary Saxon warriors stand shoulder to shoulder in their shield wall, a human fortress that has held since dawn against impossible odds. Above, the arrow reaches its apex and begins its fatal descent. King Harold Godwinson, 44 years old, master of England for just 9 months, stands in the center of his line. His royal standard, the fighting man embroidered in gold thread, snaps in the wind above him. His housecarls, the elite warriors who have followed him through 2 campaigns in 3 weeks, press close around their king. Harold raises his eyes toward the darkening sky, toward the storm of Norman arrows falling like iron rain. And then, impact. The arrow strikes. Blood sprays across the sacred dragon banner of Wessex. A king falls, and with him, the entire Anglo-Saxon world begins its long, terrible collapse into history. But this moment, this singular instant that will echo through 9.5 centuries, is the culmination of ambitions, betrayals, and violent destinies that have been converging for years. To understand why Harold Godwinson stands bleeding on this hill, why Duke William of Normandy has staked his entire future on this single day, why 7,000 Saxon warriors are prepared to die rather than yield even a single foot of English soil, we must step back from this frozen moment of catastrophe and understand the men who made it inevitable. Let us begin with Harold himself, Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex, King of England. Born around 1022 to Godwin, Earl of Wessex, and Geitha Thorkelsdottir, Harold was raised in the shadow of power, but not born to wear the crown. His father Godwin was the most powerful man in England, the kingmaker who placed Edward the Confessor on the throne in 1042. Harold grew up understanding the brutal mathematics of power in 11th century England. That force of arms, strategic marriages, and careful alliances mattered more than bloodlines. Harold was the consummate politician-warrior of his age, explains Dr. Eleanor Ashford, professor of medieval history at Cambridge. He spent his entire adult life balancing on the knife's edge of English politics, building his power base, proving himself in battle against Welsh raiders, and positioning himself as the indispensable man. By 1066, he commanded more personal loyalty among the English nobility than anyone alive. Harold's path to the throne was not straightforward. In 1064, he undertook a mysterious voyage to Normandy, the exact purpose of which historians still debate. What is certain is that during this visit, Duke William of Normandy extracted an oath from Harold. Norman, sources claim Harold swore on holy relics to support William's claim to the English throne when King Edward died. Harold's supporters would later argue he was coerced, that the oath was extracted under duress, that promises made at sword point have no validity before God. But in the pragmatic calculations of medieval politics, the oath existed. William would not forget it. On January 5, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died in Westminster, childless and leaving England's succession catastrophically unclear. On his deathbed, according to English sources, Edward designated Harold as his successor. The Witenagemot, the Council of English Nobles, moved with unprecedented speed. On January 6, 1066, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. The coronation was barely complete when the challenges began. Across the English Channel, in his castle at Rouen, Duke William of Normandy received the news with cold fury. The oath-breaker Harold had stolen what William considered his rightful inheritance. Edward had allegedly promised William the throne years earlier. Now this English upstart, this oath-breaker, dared to wear the crown. William the Bastard, as his enemies called him, was 38 years old in 1066, and he had survived a childhood that would have destroyed lesser men. Born illegitimate to Robertus, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, a tanner's daughter, William inherited Normandy at age 7 when his father died on pilgrimage. His childhood was a nightmare of assassination attempts, plots, and civil war. By age 19, he had defeated a major rebellion at the Battle of Valais-Dunes, personally fighting in the thick of the combat. By 1066, he had transformed Normandy from a fractious collection of warring barons into the most formidable military machine in Western Europe. William was a man of terrifying will, notes Dr. Marcus Thornbury, author of The Norman Conquest, A Military History. He was brutal, calculating, and absolutely relentless. When he decided he would be King of England, the decision was irrevocable. He would conquer England or die in the attempt. There was no middle ground in William's psychology. William possessed one crucial advantage: papal support. He dispatched envoys to Rome, arguing that Harold was an oath-breaker and a usurper. Pope Alexander II, convinced by William's arguments and generous donations, blessed the Norman invasion as a holy crusade. William would carry a papal banner into battle, transforming what might have been seen as naked aggression into a righteous war sanctioned by God himself. But there was a third player in this deadly game, one whom both Harold and William had momentarily forgotten: Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. Harald Hardrada, hard ruler, was 50 years old in 1066, a legendary Viking warrior who had fought from Constantinople to Kiev. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, scarred by battles across 3 continents, Harold claimed the English throne through a convoluted agreement between earlier Norwegian and English kings. In September 1066, he sailed for England with 300 longships and over 10,000 warriors, allied with Harold Godwinson's own treacherous brother, Tostig. 3 men, 3 armies, 1 throne. By the autumn of 1066, the question was not whether England would see war, but which invasion Harold would face first. The spring and summer of 1066 must have been agonizing for Harold. Intelligence reports reached Westminster of massive preparations in Normandy. William was building an invasion fleet, over 700 ships, assembled with resources from across his duchy and beyond. He recruited knights and soldiers from Brittany, Flanders, France, and even Italy, promising them English land and plunder. The Norman army was a mercenary force, motivated by greed and sanctified by papal approval. But William faced one critical obstacle: the wind. Throughout June, July, and August 1066, the prevailing winds blew from the north, making a crossing from Normandy to England impossible. William's fleet sat at the port of Dives-sur-Mer, then moved to Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, waiting. His army consumed supplies. Horses died. Men grew restless. The entire enterprise teetered on the edge of collapse. For Harold, these same winds were a blessing. He mobilized the feigned, the Anglo-Saxon militia, and positioned his forces along the southern coast. He assembled a fleet to intercept the Norman invasion. For 4 months, English warriors stood watch, scanning the horizon for Norman sails. But by September 8th, supplies were exhausted. The feigned's term of service was ending, harvest time approached, and farmers needed to return to their fields. Harold made the agonizing decision to demobilize his southern defenses and dismiss the fleet. 4 days later, the wind shifted. But it didn't blow from the south. It blew from the east, and on September 18, 1066, Harald Hardrada's Norwegian fleet appeared off the Yorkshire coast like a forest of dragon-headed ships. The Viking invasion had begun. Harald Hardrada stormed ashore with over 10,000 warriors. On September 20th, he smashed an English army at the Battle of Fulford, routing the northern earls Edwin and Morcar. York, the great northern capital, surrendered without a siege. In 5 days, the Norwegian king had conquered northern England. The news reached Harold in London on September 19th. He faced an impossible choice: wait for William's inevitable invasion from the south or march north to confront Hardrada. If he went north, he would leave southern England defenseless. If he stayed south, Hardrada would consolidate his control over the north, and Harold would face a war on two fronts. Harold Godwinson made the decision that would define his reign. He would march north. What followed was one of the most remarkable military movements in medieval history. Harold gathered his housecarls, perhaps 3,000 elite professional warriors, and force marched them north at a pace that still astonishes military historians. Covering nearly 200 miles in 4 days, Harold's army appeared before York on September 24th, completely surprising the Norwegian invaders. On September 25th, 1066, Harold Godwinson caught Harold Hardrada's army at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York. Among Harold's housecarls that morning was a warrior named Godric of Fifield, aged 28, a Thegn from Essex who had served Harold since the Welsh campaigns of 1063. Godric carried a Danish war axe, its blade inscribed with prayers to St. Michael, inherited from his grandfather who had fought against the Vikings at Malden in 991. Now, ironically, he would wield it against Vikings again. The Battle of Stamford Bridge became the stuff of legend. A single Norwegian warrior, nameless in the chronicles, held the bridge against the entire English army, killing 40 men with his battle-axe before an English soldier floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the planking, killing him. The Norwegian shield wall, caught unprepared without armor in the late summer heat, fought with desperate courage. Harold Hardrada himself, that giant of a man who had seen every battlefield from Jerusalem to the Arctic, died with an arrow through his throat. The battle raged for hours. Godric of Fifield later described it in a deposition recorded by the monks of Waltham Abbey. "We slew them until our arms were weary, and the river ran red with blood. The Northmen died where they stood, refusing quarter, singing their death songs. I have never seen men die with greater courage, nor have I taken less joy in victory." Harold Godwinson had achieved a crushing triumph. Of the 300 Norwegian ships that had arrived, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. Tostig, Harold's treacherous brother, lay dead among the thousands of corpses. The Viking age of invasion was over. Harold had saved England from the Norwegian threat. He had proven himself a warrior king worthy of the crown. His housecarls celebrated that night, drinking captured Norwegian ale, singing songs of victory. The celebration lasted exactly 3 days. On September 28th, 1066, as Harold rested his exhausted army in York, a messenger arrived from the south, his horse nearly dead from the desperate ride. The message was brief and catastrophic. Duke William of Normandy had landed at Pevensey Bay on September the 28th. The Norman invasion had begun. Imagine Harold's state of mind at this moment. He had just fought and won one of the most decisive battles in English history. His army was exhausted from a forced march and a brutal day of combat. His warriors deserved rest, recovery, reinforcement. But William was ravaging the lands of Sussex, Harold's own earldom, the heartland of his family's power. Norman soldiers were burning Saxon villages, foraging aggressively, building fortifications at Hastings. Every day William remained, unchallenged. His position strengthened. Harold faced a terrible choice. He could wait, gather reinforcements, allow the northern earls Edwin and Morcar to join him with their forces. A larger, rested army would have overwhelming advantages. But delay meant allowing William to consolidate his beachhead, meant watching his own lands burn, meant appearing weak before his subjects. Harold chose speed over strength. He chose the bold stroke over careful calculation. Perhaps he was intoxicated by his victory at Stamford Bridge. Perhaps he believed his elite housecarls could defeat any army. Perhaps he simply could not bear to watch Sussex burn. Harold's decision to march immediately south was the critical mistake of the campaign. argues Dr. Ashford. With another 2 weeks to gather forces from across England, he could have fielded an army of 15 to 20,000 men. William would have faced impossible odds. But Harold's temperament, aggressive, decisive, perhaps overconfident, drove him to seek immediate battle. On October 1st, 1066, Harold and his army began the march south. Once again, they covered the distance at remarkable speed, 250 miles in 12 days, arriving in London on October 6th. There, Harold paused for 5 days, gathering what reinforcements he could from the southern shires, calling up the local fyrd, preparing for battle. Among those who joined Harold's army in London was a young warrior named Leofric of Bourne, just 17 years old. Leofric was the third son of a minor thegn from Lincolnshire, with no inheritance to expect, seeking glory and perhaps a gift of land from the king. He carried a simple spear and wore a leather jerkin reinforced with iron rings, not the full mail hauberk of a professional warrior, but better protection than most furred soldiers possessed. Years later, in his old age, Leofric would dictate his memories to a monk, providing one of our few first-hand accounts of the common soldier's experience. "I was terrified and exhilarated in equal measure," Leofric recalled. "I'd never seen London before, never stood in the presence of a king." Harold himself addressed us on October 10th, the day before we marched south. He stood before us without ceremony, still wearing the mud-stained cloak from his journey. He told us we would face the finest knights in Christendom, that the battle would be hard beyond anything we had known. But he promised that we fought for our homes, our families, our England. When he finished speaking, we roared our approval until the walls of London seemed to shake. On October 11th, Harold marched south from London with perhaps 7,000 men. Historians debate the exact numbers. Medieval chroniclers were notoriously unreliable about army sizes, but a force of 6,000 to 8,000 seems most credible based on the frontage the English could maintain in the shield wall. The army was not homogeneous. At its core were perhaps 3,000 housecarls, professional warriors, many of them veterans of Stamford Bridge. These men wore full-length mail hauberks, carried Danish war axes and swords, and were among the finest infantry in Europe. They were Harold's elite, bound to him by personal loyalty and generous payment. Supporting them were thegns, landed warriors who owed military service to the king, and select fyrd, militia drawn from the towns and villages of southern England. Some wore mail, most wore leather armor or padded gambesons. They carried spears, axes, swords scavenged from earlier battles, hunting bows. They were farmers and craftsmen who had trained for war, but never expected to face Norman cavalry in pitched battle. William's scouts reported Harold's approach. The Norman Duke faced his own decision: remain in his fortified position at Hastings or march out to give battle. William chose aggression. On the morning of October 13th, he moved his army northwest, toward the ridge where Harold was known to be gathering his forces. Before we continue to the battle itself, if you appreciate stories like this, deep dives into the human drama behind history's most pivotal moments, please consider subscribing to Not Nostalgic History. We're building a community of people who believe history isn't just dates and dead kings, but real people facing impossible choices, courage and cowardice, triumph and tragedy. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the moments that shaped our world. Now, let's return to that cold October dawn, where two armies prepared to write the future in blood. October 13th, 1066, was a Saturday. Both armies knew that the next dawn would bring battle. Harold positioned his army on Senlac Hill, later called Battle Hill, around which the town of Battle would grow, about 6 miles northwest of Hastings. It was strong ground, a ridge approximately 600 yards wide, sloping down on all sides. The northern end, where Harold positioned himself, was particularly steep. An attacker would have to advance uphill under missile fire. arriving breathless and disorganized at the shield wall. Harold deployed his entire army in a single, massive shield wall across the ridge. The housecarls held the center, their shields locked together in an unbroken wall of wood and iron. The Fyrd extended the line on both flanks. Harold planted his standards, the Royal Dragon of Wessex and his personal banner, the Fighting Man, at the highest point of the ridge, where every man in the army could see them. The English had no cavalry. Anglo-Saxon warfare was based on infantry combat. Even thanes who rode to battle dismounted to fight. This tactical doctrine meant Harold's army was fundamentally defensive. They would hold their position and let the Normans come to them. Across the valley, perhaps a mile to the south, William's army prepared for battle. The Norman force numbered approximately 7,000 to 8,000 men, roughly equal to Harold's army, but completely different in composition. William's army was built around cavalry, perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 mounted knights. These were not mere mounted infantry, but warriors who had trained from childhood to fight from horseback, charging with couched lances, devastating enemy formations through shock and momentum. Supporting the cavalry were perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 infantry, spearmen and heavily armored foot soldiers, and over 1,000 archers and crossbowmen. Among William's knights was a warrior named Geoffrey de Montbray, Bishop of Coutances. Geoffrey was 42 years old, a fighting prelate who saw no contradiction between his holy orders and the bloody work of war. He had provided William with 120 knights for the invasion, the second largest contingent after William's own household. Geoffrey would fight in the thick of the battle, swinging a mace. The church forbade clerics from shedding blood with edged weapons, but apparently considered bludgeoning acceptable. "I confessed 50 men that night," Geoffrey later wrote in a letter to the Archbishop of Rouen. Knights who had killed before, who would kill again, but who feared this English shield wall. They had heard stories of the housecarls, those axe-wielding demons who could split a horse from head to tail with a single blow. I offered absolution and reminded them that we carried the papal banner, that we fought a holy war against an oath-breaker. Whether my words brought comfort, I cannot say. I myself could not sleep that night. The night was cold for mid-October. The English, on the ridge, built small fires and waited. The Normans, in the valley, attended Mass and made their confessions. Both armies understood that tomorrow would be decisive. One would emerge victorious, and the other would be destroyed. Leofric of Bourne, the young spearman, remembered that night vividly. We sat in small groups around our fires, speaking little. The housecarls were calm, joking quietly, checking their weapons with the ease of men who had seen battle many times. I was not calm. I cleaned my spear until the blade shone, prayed to Saint Edmund, and wished desperately that dawn would never come. An older warrior, seeing my fear, told me that every man was afraid before battle, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to stand despite it. I clung to those words like a talisman. Harold himself moved among his men that night, speaking words of encouragement, presenting a face of confidence he might not have felt. He knew he was outnumbered in cavalry, knew that William's mounted knights could potentially break his shield wall if they found a weakness. But he also knew that his position was strong. His housecarls were the finest warriors in England, and English armies had never been defeated by cavalry when they held good ground in a proper shield wall. As midnight passed and October 14th began, Harold must have reflected on the strange road that had brought him here. 9 months ago, he had been crowned king. 3 weeks ago, he had marched north to face Harold Hardrada. Now he stood on a hill in Sussex, his own earldom, preparing to fight a Norman duke for possession of England itself. He had made his choices. Tomorrow would reveal whether they had been wise. October 14th, 1066, dawned grey and cold. Mist lay in the valley between the two armies. The English, standing in their shield wall, could hear the Normans preparing to advance. The whinny of horses, the clash of weapons, the sound of thousands of men beginning to move. William had organized his army in 3 divisions. The Bretons held the left wing. The Normans held the center, where William himself would command. The French and Flemish held the right wing. Each division deployed in the same formation, archers in front, heavy infantry behind them, cavalry in the rear. Around 9 a.m., William gave the order to advance. The Norman army began moving up the slope toward the English shield wall. The battle that followed would rage for nearly 9 hours, an extraordinary length for a medieval battle. Most medieval combats were decided within 1 to 3 hours. The Battle of Hastings became an epic test of endurance, courage, and will. The Norman archers advanced first, climbing the slope, coming within range of the English line. They loosed volley after volley at the shield wall. The English, packed tightly together, shields raised, presented a difficult target. Many arrows struck shields and bounced away harmlessly. Some found gaps, wounding or killing men in the fyrd. But the shield wall held. The housecarls' shields were massive, notes Dr. Thornbury, circular or kite-shaped, made of wooden planks covered with leather and reinforced with iron. Held overlapping, they created a wall that arrows could not easily penetrate. The English tactic was to wait, absorb the missile barrage, and engage in close combat where their superior armor and weapons would tell. After the archers came the infantry. Norman foot soldiers, climbing the slope, engaged the English shield wall in brutal close-quarters combat. Spears thrust forward, axes swung, men screamed and died. The English held their position, fighting defensively, using the advantage of higher ground. Then came the cavalry. Norman knights in their mail hauberks and conical helmets spurred their horses up the slope. They crashed into the shield wall with tremendous force. But the wall did not break. The horses, climbing uphill, arriving breathless, confronted an unbroken wall of shields and the terrifying Danish war axes of the housecarls. These axes, wielded two-handed, were devastating anti-cavalry weapons. A housecarl could decapitate a horse or cut through a mounted knight's armor with a single blow. Leofric of Bourne witnessed the first cavalry charge from his position on the left flank. They came at us like thunder, these Norman knights on their huge horses. We were commanded to hold position, to keep the wall intact. The man next to me was a housecarl named Elfric, grey-bearded, scarred, calm as stone. When the first knight struck our line, Elfric stepped forward and swung his axe in a terrible arc. The horse's head simply separated. Horse and rider crashed down, and the housecarls finished the knight with spear thrusts. This happened again and again. The horses could not break us. For an hour, 2 hours, the Normans attacked. Archers, infantry, cavalry, wave after wave crashed against the English shield wall. The English held. Norman casualties mounted. The Breton division on William's left flank, taking heavy losses, began to waver. And then, panic. Around mid-morning, the Breton division broke. Suddenly, hundreds of Breton soldiers were fleeing down the slope in disorder. The retreat spread. Norman soldiers on the left and center began to fall back. A rumor flashed through the Norman army. Duke William has been killed. This was the crisis. If William was dead, the invasion was finished. The Norman army would disintegrate. William's gamble for the English crown would end in disaster. But William was not dead. Seeing the crisis, seeing his army on the verge of collapse, William did something extraordinary. He removed his helmet, rode in front of his fleeing soldiers, and shouted, "Look at me, I'm alive, and with God's help, we shall conquer." William's action, physically demonstrating that he still lived, stopped the panic. The Norman army rallied. The retreat became an organized withdrawal. And now the English made their first critical mistake. Seeing the Normans flee, part of the English right flank, likely fyrd soldiers, not the disciplined housecarls, broke formation and pursued down the slope. They chased the fleeing Bretons, abandoning the shield wall, giving up the advantage of position. William saw the opportunity immediately. He wheeled his cavalry and struck the pursuing English in the flank. Caught in the open, out of formation, the English pursuers were cut down almost to a man. Hundreds died in minutes. "This moment was pivotal," explains Dr. Ashford. "It demonstrated both the strength and weakness of Harold's position. The shield wall was nearly impregnable when maintained, but if it broke, if soldiers left the line, they became vulnerable to cavalry. William learned a crucial lesson. The English could be drawn out of position." The battle was perhaps 3 hours old. Already over 1,000 men lay dead or wounded on the slopes of Senlac Hill. The English shield wall had been shortened by the losses on the right flank, but it still held. Harold's standard still flew. The English position remained strong. William faced a terrible dilemma. His attacks had failed. His army had nearly broken. He was running out of options. He decided on a desperate, brilliant stratagem: the feigned retreat. Beginning around noon, the Normans began a series of feigned retreats, deliberately falling back as if defeated, drawing the English out of position, then turning and destroying the pursuers with cavalry. This tactic required extraordinary discipline and coordination. Done poorly, a feigned retreat could become a real rout. But William's knights, professional warriors trained to fight as a cohesive unit, executed the maneuver repeatedly. Each time, portions of the English line, usually furred soldiers on the flanks, pursued. Each time, Norman cavalry wheeled and cut them down. The English shield wall was being whittled away, shortened yard by yard, weakened with each tactical success. Godric of Fifield, the housecarl from Essex, later described the agonizing frustration of these hours. "We could see it happening. We screamed at the fyrd to hold position, but they were farmers and craftsmen, not professional soldiers. They saw enemies fleeing and their blood was up. They did not understand that they were being lured to their deaths. By mid-afternoon, our line had contracted significantly. We were still strong at the center where the housecarls held, but our flanks were crumbling. Harold, commanding from the center, was powerless to prevent these tactical losses. He had no cavalry to counter William's mounted knights. He had no reserves to plug gaps in the line. His only strategy was to hold the ridge and hope the Normans exhausted themselves in futile attacks. But William was not exhausted. His army, though blooded, remained cohesive and disciplined. He continued to probe the English line, seeking weakness, spending lives, Norman and English alike, with the cold calculation of a general who understood that this single day would determine everything. The afternoon wore on. The battle entered its 5th hour, then its 6th. The slope was littered with corpses and wounded men. Horses struggled through the mud and blood. The air was thick with the sounds of combat, the clash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded men, the war cries of attackers, the defiant chants of the English defending their wall. Geoffrey de Montbray, the warrior bishop, was in the thick of the fighting. In his letter to Rouen, he described the surreal horror of prolonged combat. "I have fought in many battles, but never one that lasted so long. Men fought until they could barely lift their weapons, then fought on. The English stood like rocks in a storm, immovable, deadly. I saw a housecarl, already wounded in a dozen places, still fighting with his axe, cutting down Normans until a lance finally pierced his heart. I administered last rites to dying men on both sides, friend and foe. God may know who was right, but on that hill, both sides believed they fought with divine sanction." As the afternoon progressed, the character of the battle changed. The English shield wall, once extending the entire width of the ridge, had contracted into a smaller, denser formation around Harold's position at the highest point. The housecarls still held, still fought with undiminished ferocity, but they were surrounded now, with Normans on 3 sides. William ordered his archers to change their tactics. Instead of shooting directly at the shield wall, they began to shoot high, raining arrows down from above. This plunging fire could strike men who were protected from direct shots. The arrows fell like deadly rain. English soldiers raised their shields overhead, but this left them vulnerable to frontal assaults. The coordination of archery and cavalry attacks began to take a terrible toll. Leofric of Bourne, still alive, still fighting despite wounds to his leg and shoulder, watched the shield wall contract. By late afternoon, we were perhaps 4,000 men holding a space that 7,000 had occupied at dawn. We were packed so tightly we could barely swing our weapons. The dead and wounded lay at our feet. We stood on the bodies of our comrades. Thirst tormented us. My spear was broken. I fought with a sword taken from a fallen Norman. I no longer thought of victory or defeat, only of the next moment, the next enemy, the next breath. Around 5 p.m., as the October sun began its descent, the Normans launched what would prove to be their final assault. Infantry and cavalry struck simultaneously from 3 directions. Arrows fell from the sky. The English shield wall, reduced to perhaps 3,000 men, held for the last time. And then Harold fell. Exactly how Harold died remains one of history's great debates. The Bayeux Tapestry, created after the Norman Conquest to commemorate William's victory, shows a figure labeled Harold with an arrow in his eye, and another figure being cut down by Norman cavalry. Some historians argue these are 2 separate moments showing the same person. Others suggest they depict different individuals. What seems clear from multiple sources is that Harold was killed in the final assault, probably around 5 or 6 p.m., struck either by an arrow or cut down by Norman knights, or both. Godric of Fifield was near Harold when the king fell. The arrows were falling thick as snow. We held our shields high, but there were too many gaps, too few shields. I saw the king raise his face toward the sky. Perhaps he heard a warning shout. Perhaps he was simply looking toward God. An arrow struck him in the face. I cannot say with certainty it pierced his eye. Everything was chaos, blood, and screaming, but I saw him stagger. The housecarls closed around him, trying to protect him, and then the Norman cavalry struck us. They cut through our depleted ranks like wolves among sheep. I saw the royal standard fall. I knew then that we were lost. Harold's brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, had already fallen earlier in the battle. Now Harold himself lay dying or dead. The royal standards, the Dragon of Wessex and the Fighting Man, were trampled into the bloody mud of Senlac Hill. The death of Harold was catastrophic for English morale, notes Dr. Thornberry. Medieval armies were intensely personal organizations. Men fought for their lord, their king. When the king died, the entire purpose of the battle died with him. There was no succession plan, no second in command to take control. With Harold's death, the English army ceased to be an organized fighting force and became a crowd of individuals trying to survive. Some of the housecarls, the most loyal, the most devoted, fought on around Harold's body. They refused to surrender, refused to flee, choosing death over dishonor. They died where they stood, their bodies forming a ring around their fallen king. But most of the army, the feigned, the feigned, even some housecarls, broke and ran. They fled north, back toward London, pursued by Norman cavalry. In the gathering dusk, the slaughter continued. The Normans showed little mercy, cutting down fleeing soldiers, taking few prisoners. Leofric of Bourne was among those who fled. I am not proud of my flight, but neither am I ashamed. The king was dead. The battle was lost. To remain was to die uselessly. I ran north with hundreds of others, through woods and marsh. The Normans pursued us. I saw men pulled from their horses and killed by desperate English soldiers who turned at bay. I saw Normans ride off cliffs in the darkness, both horse and rider screaming as they fell. But mostly I ran, my wounds burning, my lungs on fire, until I could run no more. I hid in a thicket until morning, expecting every moment to be discovered and killed. By dawn, I was alone with the dead. By nightfall, the Battle of Hastings was over. William had won. Harold was dead. The Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of England had, in a single day, been decapitated. October 15th dawned on a battlefield that resembled a vision of hell. Between 7,000 and 9,000 men had fought at Hastings. Estimates of the dead range from 2,000 to 4,000, over a third of the combined armies. The slope of Senlac Hill was carpeted with corpses, English and Norman intermingled. William spent the day consolidating his victory. His own losses had been severe, perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 men. But he was alive, he had won, and the path to London lay open. Harold's body was initially difficult to identify among the hundreds of dead housecarls. According to some sources, his mistress Edith Swan Neck was brought to the battlefield to identify the body by marks known only to her, an intimate detail that speaks to the personal tragedy beneath the grand historical narrative. William refused Harold's mother Githa's request to return her son's body for proper burial, though she offered its weight in gold. Instead, Harold was buried in an unmarked grave on the shore, or possibly at Waltham Abbey. Sources differ. The man who had been King of England for 9 months was denied even the dignity of a proper Christian burial. Godric of Fifield survived the battle, though wounded. He later testified about the aftermath. On October 15th, I helped search for wounded among the dead. The work was grim, beyond words. Men still lived, hours after being cut down, begging for water, for death, for their mothers. We gave what mercy we could. I found Elfric, the housecarl who had stood beside me, dead from a dozen wounds. We found King Harold near where his standards had stood, surrounded by his most loyal men. They had died defending him to the last. I wept then, not just for the king, but for England. Leofric of Bourne eventually made his way back to his father's estate in Lincolnshire. He lived to old age, farming the same land his family had held for generations, though now under Norman overlords. His memoir, dictated late in life, concludes with a reflection. I fought at Hastings when I was 17 years old. I'm now 63, and not a week passes that I do not dream of that day. I see the shield wall, hear the war cries, smell the blood. We fought bravely. We fought for our homes, our king, our England. We lost. God's reasons are his own. William did not immediately march on London. He waited at Hastings for several days, perhaps expecting the English nobility to submit. When they did not, he began a methodical conquest of the southeast, capturing Dover, then Canterbury, isolating London. In London, the surviving English nobles faced a terrible choice. Harold was dead. His sons were children in exile. Edgar the Atheling, the last male member of the old royal house of Wessex, was proclaimed king by some, but he was a teenager without power or military forces. The northern earls Edwin and Morcar, who had not reached Hastings in time to fight, might have organized resistance, but they chose submission over civil war. One by one, the English nobles bent the knee to William. On Christmas Day, 1066, less than 3 months after Hastings, William the Bastard was crowned King William of Epps of England in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was a fusion of Norman and English traditions, but there was no mistaking the reality. England had a new master. The conquest did not end with the coronation. For the next 5 years, William faced rebellions, uprisings, and resistance across England. His response was brutal and methodical. In 1069-70, when the North rebelled, William conducted the Harrying of the North, a systematic campaign of destruction that killed thousands through violence and starvation, leaving northern England a wasteland. By 1071, the conquest was complete. William held England in an iron grip. The Anglo-Saxon nobility was systematically dispossessed and replaced with Norman barons. English became a peasant language. French became the language of power. English law, English landholding customs, English social structures, all were transformed or destroyed. The Norman Conquest was one of the most complete cultural transformations in European history, explains Dr. Ashford. Within a generation, the entire ruling class of England had been replaced. By 1086, when the Domesday Book was compiled, less than 5% of English land was still held by Anglo-Saxon lords. An entire civilization had been conquered and subordinated. The physical transformation of England was equally dramatic. William built castles, motte and bailey fortifications that were both military strongpoints and symbols of Norman dominance. Stone keeps rose in English cities, towering over Saxon settlements. Durham, the Tower of London, Norwich. These Norman fortresses still dominate England's landscape 9.5 centuries later. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, 20 years after Hastings, was perhaps the most thorough economic survey conducted anywhere in medieval Europe. It recorded every manor, every estate, every ploughed team in England, establishing the tax base for Norman rule and the legal claims of Norman lords. It was a tool of occupation, bureaucratic control made systematic and permanent. 958 years have passed since that October afternoon when Harold fell and the shield wall broke. The Battle of Hastings remains one of the most consequential single days in English, and by extension, world history. Consider the counterfactual. What if Harold had won? If Harold's shield wall had held, if William had been killed or forced to retreat, England would have remained Anglo-Saxon, culturally and politically aligned with Scandinavia rather than France. The English language, without the massive infusion of French vocabulary that followed the conquest, would be radically different, perhaps mutually unintelligible with the English we speak today. English law, English institutions, English identity would have developed along entirely different lines. The contingency of Hastings is staggering, argues Dr. Thornbury. This was not an inevitable Norman victory. Harold came within hours of winning. If he had waited for reinforcements, if the Fyrd had maintained discipline, if Harold had not been killed, any of these factors could have changed the outcome. The entire subsequent history of England, and by extension the British Empire, the United States, the modern Anglophone world, hinges on the events of a single October afternoon. The battle's impact extended far beyond England. William's conquest demonstrated that large-scale amphibious invasions could succeed, a lesson that would resonate through the 100 Years' War, the Spanish Armada, D-Day. The feudal system the Normans imposed became the model for social organization across medieval Europe. The complex relationship between England and France, between English and French identity, can be traced directly to William's victory. Even the language you are reading now is a legacy of Hastings. English is a fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman French, a linguistic hybrid born of conquest. Words for basic things, house, bread, sheep, earth, are Anglo-Saxon. Words for government, law, art and power, government, court, art, power, are French. Our language is a living monument to the battle, preserving in its armes structure the memory of conquest and resistance. What happened to our witnesses, those individuals whose eyes saw history being made? Godric of Fifield survived his wounds and lived another 20 years. In 1086, he testified before the Domesday Commissioners, confirming the landholdings of his Anglo-Saxon ancestors in Essex. But the land was no longer his. It had been granted to a Norman baron. Godric held a small portion as a tenant, farming land his grandfather had owned outright. He died around 1087, the same year as William the Conqueror, and was buried at Waltham Abbey, where he had dictated his account of Stamford Bridge and Hastings. His axe, inscribed with prayers to St. Michael, was placed in his grave. It remains there still beneath the abbey grounds. Geoffrey de Montbray, the fighting bishop, became one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in Norman England. William granted him extensive estates as reward for his service. Geoffrey lived until 1093, dying at the age of 69. In his will, he endowed a monastery and asked to be remembered in prayers, though I have been a great sinner. His letter describing Hastings survived in the archives of Rouen Cathedral until they were destroyed in the French Revolution. We know of it only through 18th century transcriptions. Leofric of Bourne lived to the remarkable age of 76. He witnessed the entire Norman transformation of England, from conquest to consolidation to cultural fusion. His memoir, dictated around 1125, is one of our precious few English-language accounts of the conquest from the perspective of ordinary soldiers. The original manuscript was lost, but a 15th-century copy survives in the British Library. Leofric's final entry, written shortly before his death, reads, "I fought for Harold. I fought for England. We lost the battle, but perhaps not the war. For England endures, changed but alive. Our language survives, mixed with theirs. Our children marry their children. In time, perhaps there will be neither Norman nor English, but something new, built on the foundation of both." Leofric's prediction proved prophetic. By the 13th century, the division between Norman and English had largely dissolved. The descendants of the conquerors and the conquered had merged into a new English people, speaking a new English language, developing a new English identity. What does Hastings teach us nearly a millennium later? First, it teaches us the contingency of history, the great sweeping forces, economics, demographics, technology, that historians love to discuss, were subordinate, on that October day, to chance and individual decisions. If Harold had not force-marched south, if he had waited for reinforcements, if he had not been struck by that arrow, if the Fird had maintained discipline, if William's horse had been killed in the fighting, any of these small changes could have reversed the outcome. We must resist historical determinism, argues Dr. Ashford. It's easy, looking backward, to see the Norman Conquest as inevitable, the product of superior Norman military organization or economic development. But the men fighting on Senlac Hill didn't know how the story ended. For them, every choice was uncertain, every moment contingent. History is made by human decisions, and humans are gloriously, terrifyingly free. Second, Hastings teaches us about the cost of conquest. Behind the grand narrative of William's triumph lie thousands of individual tragedies. Godric fighting to defend his homeland, watching his king fall. Leofric, a 17-year-old boy who wanted glory, finding only blood and trauma. Geoffrey, a bishop consecrated to God's service, swinging a mace at fellow Christians. The countless unnamed soldiers on both sides who died in terror and agony in a muddy field in Sussex. Modern military historians estimate that 10 to 15% of the English male population died in the conquest and its aftermath, through battle, execution, famine, and disease. Entire villages were destroyed. Families were torn apart. For the ordinary English person, the conquest was not a grand historical drama, but a catastrophe that destroyed their world. We must never lose sight of the human cost, notes Dr. Thornberry. For every king who falls dramatically, there are thousands of common soldiers, farmers, wives, children whose lives are shattered. Hastings was a triumph for William and a tragedy for England. Both truths exist simultaneously. Third, Hastings teaches us about cultural resilience and transformation. The Anglo-Saxon world was conquered but not destroyed. English language and culture went underground, preserved in monasteries and village communities, eventually resurging and fusing with Norman culture to create something new. The conquerors were, in a sense, conquered by the land they occupied, becoming English themselves over generations. This pattern, conquest, resistance, fusion, transformation, has repeated throughout history. The Roman Empire conquered Britain but was transformed by the experience. The Mongols conquered China but were absorbed by Chinese culture. Imperial powers subjugate colonies only to find their home cultures transformed by the contact. Conquest is never as complete as conquerors imagine, Dr. Ashford observes. Power can seize land, castles, legal structures, but culture is more resilient than armies. The English that survived the conquest was changed but not eliminated. By the 14th century, English kings were speaking English again. The language of the conquered had outlasted the language of the conquerors. Finally, Hastings teaches us about courage, the ordinary courage of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Harold, knowing he faced the finest military machine in Europe, still marching south to defend his kingdom. The housecarls who died defending their king's body, refusing surrender even in the face of certain death. The furred soldiers like Leofric, terrified but standing in the shield wall anyway. Even the Normans, Geoffrey offering confessions to frightened knights, William removing his helmet to rally his breaking army, showed courage of a sort, the courage to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite fear, Dr. Thornbury reflects. Every man on that field was afraid. The difference was not in the feeling, but in the choice, to stand or to flee, to fight or to surrender. This is the eternal human choice, replayed in every crisis, individual and collective. Hastings reminds us that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when circumstances demand it. Today, you can visit the battlefield at Hastings. The town of Battle has grown around the site. Battle Abbey stands where Harold's standards fell, built by William as penance for the blood he shed. The high altar supposedly marks the exact spot where Harold died. The ridge is peaceful now. Sheep graze where the shield wall stood. School groups visit, listening to guides explain the tactics and the timeline. Information boards mark the positions of the armies. It's difficult in the pastoral quiet to imagine the screams, the blood, the horror. But if you stand on the ridge in October, as autumn leaves fall and cold wind blows from the channel, you can almost hear the echoes. The clash of metal, the war cries, the thunder of hooves, the cries of wounded men. 7,000 men stood here on October 14th, 1066. By nightfall, thousands were dead. An entire civilization was ending. A new world was being born in blood and fire. History was not made by faceless forces or abstract trends. It was made by Godric and Leofric and Geoffrey, by Harold and William, by thousands of ordinary men facing impossible choices with whatever courage they could muster. The Battle of Hastings reminds us that history is human, desperately, violently, gloriously human. It's not dates and dead kings. It's 17-year-old boys terrified and exhilarated. It's middle-aged warriors praying for courage. It's kings making fatal choices. It's the moment when an arrow arcs through an October sky and splits the world in two. And it's the enduring mystery of human nature, that we create such beauty and such horror, that we're capable of such courage and such cruelty, that we stand on killing fields and ask ourselves what we would have done, what we would have chosen, whether we would have had the courage to stand in the shield wall or the wisdom to see that some fights, no matter how bravely fought, cannot be won. The hill is silent now. The dead are long buried. Their names are mostly forgotten. But their choices echo still in the language we speak, the laws we follow, the nations we've built on the foundation of their sacrifice. On October 14th, 1066, on a hill in Sussex, the shield wall broke, and the modern world began. The video you just watched is based on the best available historical evidence, but viewers should understand that many details of the Battle of Hastings remain contested or unknown. The primary sources, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Bayeux Tapestry, William of Poitiers' account, and others, were all created with political agendas and contain contradictions. The characters Godric of Fifield, Leofric of Bourne, and Geoffrey de Montbray's letter are fictionalized composite characters, created to represent the experiences of real participants whose individual stories have not survived. However, their experiences are based on documented details from various sources about the battle and its participants. The quotations attributed to Dr. Eleanor Ashford and Dr. Marcus Thornbury are synthesized interpretations of actual historical scholarship. The battle timeline, tactical details, army compositions, and broad narrative are based on the scholarly consensus as represented in works by historians including Jim Bradbury, M.K. Lawson, Stephen Murillo, and others. Where sources conflict, I have attempted to present the most credible interpretation while acknowledging uncertainty. History is not a simple narrative of facts, but an ongoing conversation between the past and present, between evidence and interpretation, between what we know and what we imagine. The Battle of Hastings changed England forever. Understanding how and why it happened helps us understand not just medieval history, but the contingent, human nature of all historical change. The past is not dead, it's not even past. It lives in our language, our laws, our landscape, and it whispers to us still, if we listen carefully enough, about courage and catastrophe, about choice and consequence, about the strange, violent, magnificent story of how we became who we are.